Parliament ending the slave trade, but tragically paying so much compensation to the slave owners that that compensation was only finally paid off in 2015. So there's an awful big weight of history on all of this. But our campaign is for decency, is to have those bodies returned, and is to recall with admiration all those that contributed to the hope that was the revolution in Grenada. Jean, thank you very much. And again, I apologize for not being on the call at the very beginning, as I should have been.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry about muting myself. Could I ask people if they have any more comments or questions to put them up on the chat? I'm going to invite Alan Scott to speak now. Alan, are you there?
I am.
Alan is from Unite the Union. He's also the Secretary of the Committee for Human Rights in Grenada and a very long-standing campaigner on many issues, particularly on behalf of the working people of Grenada in general and on human rights issues in Grenada. He's published a number of booklets that have been jointly published by Committee for Human Rights in Grenada and the Caribbean Labour Solidarity. I would say the vast majority of our literature is produced by Alan, and he's made it a special study of his. And also I must mention Noreen Scott as well in this, who has been very active in doing huge amounts of research in regard to finding out the information about what has happened, what has been done to the bodies of these great Caribbean leaders. So, Alan, thank you very much.
Can I say at the start that I would like to echo something that Dennis said when Bernard Cord was over here a couple of years ago. I attended a number of the meetings, and there were still a lot of very distressed Grenadians who wanted to know what had happened to the bodies, and had very clearly been sold the American PSYOPs line that they were deliberately hiding them or were never ever going to allow them to be revealed. Even though at the actual trial of the Grenada 17, the prosecution actually gave evidence of digging where the bodies were and having dug them up. This doesn't seem to have actually got across to the public in general, and having attended part of the appeal hearing, although I didn't attend the trial, of course the court was actually in the middle of the prison, and you had to go through a posse of armed guards to get in. And at the sessions I attended, I don't think, apart from a couple of campaigners, any Grenadian was there apart from one of the mother of one of the prisoners, who would faithfully walk up the great big hill every single day to attend the hearing. So although these rumours were actually being put about without any great factual base, the true facts, of course, that they were actually being admitted in the court don't seem to have been published. Now, this presentation I'm doing is basically based on two things. Firstly, an affidavit that was part of the Privy Council, the presentation to the Privy Council that eventually got rid of the whole life sentences. And secondly, a report that was produced from the Presentation Brothers College, who over a period of time undertook some research into what had actually happened to the bodies. Now, I think later in the year after Bernard had been in England, my wife and I were in Grenada, and we were approached to see if we would talk to a couple of the people that had been involved in that research. And it was very clear that although a pamphlet had been produced, it was part of a competition, the general circulation of that pamphlet had been suppressed. And we were given an electronic copy, because there only seemed to be one hard copy in existence. We were given an electronic copy and asked if we could actually publish it in the UK in some form. And the document that's on our website is basically the research that those students carried out. Now, the starting point of this is the 19th of October, which is after the sad execution had been carried out. A soldier called Callistus was asked by a senior officer in the PRA that they had a grave concern that they couldn't hand over the bodies immediately, because that might actually and into an immediate burial, because that could lead to some unrest in the country, and that therefore the army had taken temporary control of the bodies, and he was given a task which he wasn't very happy with, of securing the bodies for a brief period. And he seems to have gone away and discussed with some other soldiers about various methods of trying to preserve the bodies. They couldn't locate deep freezers. There was a discussion about using barrels of spirit, which they couldn't also find. So in the end, they hit upon burying the bodies at the military base in Calvini, where there were actually trenches dug already, because it was part of the fortification for the army camp. So the bodies were, 9 bodies were transported to Calvini in the army camp in a lorry. I think the final bit of the journey had to be done in 2 or 3 trips in a van, because it was pouring with rain and the lorry wouldn't go through. And at this point, Callistus in his affidavit says that one of the other soldiers, Fabian Gabriel, said that the bodies would quickly rot if they were just buried. And he proposed using some sort of technique for primitive embalming in bodies, which he said he'd learnt in Honduras, which was the application of moderate heat. At this point, that process seems to have started. Callistus went back to talk to the army officer to indicate what was going on. The army officer was exceedingly unhappy and told him to go straight back and stop the heating process straight away, which he says that he did. The 9 bodies were buried in that trench. This version was also confirmed in the evidence of Fabian Gabriel at the trial of the Grenadian 17. So what we do know is that on the 19th of October, 9 bodies were actually placed in a trench in the camp. As we know, shortly after, on the 23rd and 25th, the Americans invaded. And so at that point, virtually all of the soldiers and many other people over a very short period were arrested and put into camps. One of the things that Fabian Gabriel admits in his evidence is that he made one further journey to the camp, which was around the 4th or 5th of November, after he'd been interrogated, presumably to show them where the bodies were actually kept. Now, I suspect people aren't aware of the interrogations that took place in Grenada. A considerable number of people were tortured, badly beaten. Some offered bribes, all towards the same end, which was to actually say that Bernard Cord had sought the death of Maurice Bishop, because this seems to be the narrative the Americans were actually embarked on. Now, it's interesting, at the start of the pamphlet, the students came to the conclusion that although they hadn't found the whereabouts of the remains of Maurice Bishop, the results of our investigation, this is an actual quote from them, the results of the investigation are shocking. We believe we uncovered a plot to hide the remains of Maurice Bishop. And that was what the Grenadian students concluded. Now, from the timeline, it's very clear that on the 2nd of November, Fabian Gabriel, in his interrogation by the Barbadian forces, indicated where these 9 bodies were. So by the 2nd of November, within a week of invading, the Americans are aware of their presence. And as I say, he seems to have made a visit with Inspector Watson on the 4th or 5th of November. On the 6th of November, Daniel Drostoff, the senior editor of the United Press International, issued a statement that US officials have found several bodies at the camp. And the following day, the New York Times reported that bodies had been found in the training camp at Albany. So following on Fabian Gabriel's investigation, treatment, it is very, very clear that the Americans knew where the bodies were. Now, on the 9th of November, a group calling itself the Grave Registration Group actually went to the burial site with a soldier from the peacekeeping force, a Jamaican named Earl Brown, as a result of information not supplied by Faber and Gabriel, but from an interrogation of somebody called Christopher Bowen, who was a cook who was actually based at Albany at the army camp. And he gave a detailed account to the students in an email message of what he actually found at the time. He indicated that while interrogated, information came to light that bodies were buried in a pit and that they were said to be of Morris Bishop, Jacqueline Creft, and 3 other members of the government. So he says they arrived at Calavigny around sometime in the afternoon, around 2 or 3 o'clock. The site is dug up and they found remains that were partially burnt, partially decomposed. And he says it was quite obvious that one of the bodies was female. He said there was no mistake that there was definitely a female in that pit. Skulls along with other body parts were found. And based on the information we had received about who was shot and disposed of at that location, and based on the description of the clothing that the victims were wearing when the remains were recovered, it was very clear that Mr. Bishop and Miss Crest's bodies were among the 5 that were recovered in Calavigny. And he says at that time, based on the information, it was quite obvious that those people were in the pit. And those of you that saw the photographs at the start will actually see that there are photographic evidence of the Americans digging up the bodies from the pits in bags, and that those bodies are, or the shape of them in the bags, are whole. So what you have are remains. He also went on to indicate that, you know, today we'd obviously use DNA and other technology. At the time of the recovery, although we could not identify each body by their features, you could make positive identification based on information about the clothing that each person was wearing at the time of death and what was already established by people who were at the fort on that day. The report would be wrong if it stated there was a female clothing but no body parts. There were female body parts actually there. And he made it clear that he actually, when he says female body parts, he specifically remembered seeing breasts and genitals. So at the time when the bodies are taken out of that grave, the 5 bodies, they are in bags, they are whole. This version of events was confirmed by a statement from a US Army captain who was in charge of this group, Henry Fore, who told the press that US soldiers had today found burnt and decomposed bodies of 3 people, including the skeleton remains of the slain Prime Minister Morris Bishop, and he indicated that one of the skeletal remains was that of a woman. So at the time when they're coming out of the pit where they'd actually been buried, there's confirmation from 2 people about the state of the bodies, and that one of them is Morris Bishop and one of them is Jacqueline Creft. Now, the US military contacted Dr. Lennon at St. George's University and asked if the Gross lab could be used to examine some of the remains that had been found. And on the next day, on the 10th, Dr. Jordan told the students, and Dr. Jordan seems to have kept a very, very detailed record in his diary. He said that troops brought over 6 body bags. There were pieces of meat and bones. There were pieces of skull, but no intact skulls. And in fact, no real bodies, just pieces of bodies. And in his evidence to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he indicated they'd found bits of scalp and hair, which I think he said his quote was, "We identified as Baines." And I think they managed to identify the remains of Jacqueline Creft. But he denied that Bishop's remains were present. However, he then indicated that in his view, the bodies had been dynamited. And so it was possible that Bishop's remains were there amongst what he described as unidentifiable parts. And he said that the ends of the bones were charred and splintered, which it would be consistent with the bodies having either been dynamited or run over by a vehicle. Now, the report says the remains were collected by his funeral home on the 12th of November, but it is not entirely clear then what happened. The students saw a report from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, who I think they sent some people over from the States to the university to actually have a look. And their conclusion was very, very different from the earlier conclusion. Was that Maurice Bishop's wasn't there, neither were there any female remains, which is totally contradictory to what had been said earlier. Now, they were very surprised by the findings, and particularly the absence of female remains, which seemed to be contrary to the evidence. And so they approached Dr. Jordan again, who confirmed his examination that he'd actually found a female pelvis, and actually that it is actually because of the notches that clearly it was somebody that had actually given birth to at least one child. They therefore concluded that there had been an attempt to hide the truth about the discovery of Jacqueline Crest's body, and they posed the question that maybe this was because people would have realised that if Jacqueline's body was there, so would Maurice's have been, and that's what they didn't want to find out. And their comment was that they were insulted that the intelligence of Grenadians could be mocked in this way. Because there's a contradiction in the evidence between what the Jamaican said, Earl, and what was subsequently the bodies suddenly being in bits, when they get to the university, they contacted him again to discuss this contradiction. And his response was that he was very hurt by the fact that Maurice Bishop was killed, and was happy that he was involved in finding his body. So I say finding his body because based on the information we had received at the time regarding the number of bodies and the specific descriptions regarding the clothing that they were wearing at the time of death, the bodies were put in body bags and tagged as to who was in what. I must say that although the bodies were partially burnt, we recovered more than just bones. It was very positive that one female body was inside that grave along with 4 males. There were skulls, bones, flesh part that we recovered. So the young readers concluded that the evidence actually suggests that someone removed complete skulls between the time that the remains were recovered in Calavigny and their arrival at the lab in Grandance and St George's the next day. And they posed the question, why would somebody do this? Because at the time, DNA testing was not developed, so the only way to identify human beings was by an examination of the skulls and particular dentation. So their view was that it was a hasty job to remove complete skulls to avoid proper identification of the bodies. Now, initially, they thought that the remains had been taken straight away from Calavigny to the lab, but 2 pieces of evidence show that that wasn't the case. Firstly, a photograph in the Trinidad Guardian of the US soldiers shows that they're actually carrying bodies. Despite the fact the Americans say no photographs were taken, they appear in the pamphlets, they have appeared in the press, and they show, and the company's new report said 4 bodies were recovered. Secondly, although the recovered bodies were placed in 5 labelled body bags, what was subsequently delivered to the university is 6 garbage bags, just containing fragments. And they therefore conclude that these remains were tampered with, and that during the 16-hour period, skulls and other body parts were removed to confuse the identification of the remains. Now, that is evidence that has been produced by people in Grenada. As I say, the initial report was published as a pamphlet as part of a competition, a research competition, it is pretty clear from the individuals that we spoke to that further publication was stopped. One of them did actually go to New York to try and raise matters at the United Nations and was pretty firmly put in his place. And so although he was very, very keen that we would actually try to use this evidence to do something, he's very, very clear that he's very worried about actually being publicly involved any further. And I think arising from this, there's a number of questions. First of all, both Callistus and Gabriel are very, very clear that they buried 9 bodies in Camp Freedom. So far, only 5 seem to have been found. So there's no indication of what happened to the other 4, and every press release seems to contain a different number. Secondly, Fabian Gabriel revealed the bodies and the others were buried at the camp on the 2nd of November. And yet, officially, there doesn't seem to be any attempt at recovery until the 8th of November. And that's only after information was actually given by somebody else, Christopher Brown. So there's no explanation as to why Inspector Watson went with Gabriel on the 4th or 5th of November and what they did. A very key question is, there seems to be, as the evidence is clear, that the bodies were desecrated between being dug up and being delivered to a university. Who did this and what was the reason for this, let's face it, appalling action? Why have the US sought to deny the presence of the remains of Jacqueline Kraft after they initially announced that they'd actually found her body? And of course, the very important question, what did the US forces do with the remains after they'd been examined at the university? Because that isn't clear. I know there are various comments that people have made about where they might have been buried, they were taken to the States, etc. But there isn't any firm evidence in the report to justify any of that. Much of this evidence was actually put to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was set up in Grenada. And they made a recommendation to the government that they should make serious efforts to ascertain the location of the remains. As far as I can see, no effort has been made whatsoever by any of the Grenadian governments. And the final point, I mean, all the evidence about the recovery of the bodies was not actually given at the trial. Earl wasn't called, so there's no evidence at the trial given that, in fact, what they actually had when they exhumed the bodies was whole bodies. And instead, apparently, the prosecution made great play of the fact that the bodies were so severely damaged they looked nothing like, just like fried eggs. So it is possible that there's an argument that the prosecution misled the jury. So I'll finish with that, sir. Chair.
Alan, thank you very much for that very comprehensive review of that material, which is very complicated, but very, very important in terms of the campaign that we want to run. The questions and comments that we've received on the chat seem to be mainly of 2 types. One, which is seeking more information about the actual events in Grenada at that time and what happened to the bodies. And secondly, what can we do to move these things forward? And I'm suggesting, Alan, that I think you've got the questions on or the comments on the chat there. That maybe you answer some of those ones that are more to do with the details about to do with the bodies. For example, there's one from Zohra Francis, who's asking, is it definite the remains were removed from the island? Isn't it just as likely that they were buried in an unmarked grave in the main cemetery? And there's 1 or 2 others like that that maybe you'd like to address.
There is more detail in the pamphlet which people can simply download off the website, as far as I'm aware. The report doesn't conclude what happened to what actually was then done with the remains. There are some people who are saying that they were taken to the States. There were others that are saying that they were simply disposed of in the cemetery, though I believe Maurice's bishop, his daughter, subsequently did some sort of search around that, or that's what we were told, and that they couldn't locate anything. But also, it doesn't explain the lack of number, because we started out with 9 bodies. The Jamaican, whose stuff is very clear, says they had 5, and that at the time that they took the bodies were taken away, they had actually named the bodies, and they were in proper body bags. The really disturbing thing for me is that they were clearly destroyed overnight before they were actually delivered to the lab. So actually identification was really difficult. But even so, there's still no explanation of what happened to the other 4. It is possible that they were just strewn away, although I get the impression that the family of the funeral parlour actually deny this very strongly. But there does seem to be the whole thing around the narrative was around demonising particular individuals, and one of their arguments was that, he's got the bodies and you will never find them. And I sadly suspect that this is just part of that process, unfortunately. But the fact of the matter is that what do you do? People need to be asking the Grenadian government to put pressure on the United States to return the remains and to explain what they did with them. And if it is the case that those bodies that they exhumed were then dynamited or destroyed in some other way, then they need to explain why they did that. It's quite ironic that the Americans go to great effort to get their own war dead returned. Yet they seem to be able to treat people with, frankly, callous disregard, as far as I can see.